You're listening to Boobies and Newbies, brought to you by the Frolic Podcast Network. This episode is brought to you by Kensington's newest title from New York Times bestselling author Jodi Thomas, Dinner on Primrose Hill. A fifth-generation Texan, Jodi Thomas sets many of her award-winning stories, including Dinner on Primrose Hill, in her home state. If you're a fan of small-town romance, then you will love this one because it doesn't get much smaller than Honey Creek, Texas, population 12,000. Dinner on Primrose Hill, the third installment in Jodi's Honey Creek series, is set in a nearby college town and revolves around two chemistry professors, one of whom is a plus-size heroine, which y'all know is my bread and butter. It's got opposites attract, office romance, it's got STEM rep, plus with the holidays coming up, I think this book would make the perfect gift or book club pick for the readers in your life. You can find Dinner on Primrose Hill by Jodi Thomas wherever books are sold. Find out more at kensingtonbooks.com. And now, back to the show. Welcome to Boobies and Newbies, the podcast that asks novice romance readers to think outside the dick in a box and brave the unbridled world of erotica. I'm your host, Kelly Reynolds, and it's time for another Steamy Spotlight interview. Today's guest recently released her first book under the pen name Erin Sterling, but you probably already know her as New York Times bestselling author Rachel Hawkins. I had the pleasure of speaking with her last month as part of a virtual book club where we discussed, i.e. fawned over, her latest release, The Ex Hex. Here to discuss all things witchy and romancy is Erin Sterling. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I just realized I was about to start giggling when you said the name of the podcast. I'm like, wow, I'm already failing at my first romance novel podcast as I giggle over boobies.
It's great because I feel like I make a genuine connection with my guests depending on how giggly they get during both boobies and dick in a box. So I can tell we're on the same wavelength, that being the mindset of like a 14-year-old boy.
Right. And then I was immediately delighted. Y'all can't see, but I did. I smiled as soon as it said boobies and then dick in a box. So I'm here for it all.
Yeah, we don't say boobies enough in real life, so I try to rectify that on the podcast.
It's such a great word. I don't know if you've seen the movie Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar,
I just watched it a month ago and I loved it.
It's my favorite movie. It's so funny. And there's a whole running joke about how the lounge singer at the hotel just keeps singing songs about boobies. Yeah. And it's just in the background and it kills me every single time. I've watched the movie 12 times and I laugh every booby joke.
They're hilarious. And also, can we talk about how Jamie Dornan is actually funny? I had no idea.
Jamie Dornan, what a comeback. What a redemption story, my man. Because I always thought he was a little wooden. He's very handsome.
Right.
But no, he was hilarious. And obviously really willing to look silly, which is always very hot to me. I'm a man that's I will go there for a laugh.
Exactly. And it's when you least expect it. It was the same way I felt when Regé Jean Paul, is that his name?
Yeah,
I always mix up
Page,
names.
Yeah.
John Page. When he was when he hosted SNL, I was
so good.
This guy is also funny. This is not fair to the people in the world. You cannot be that beautiful, that talented, and also hilarious.
Yeah, it's not cool. It's not cool. But they're out there just being menaces.
Oh, I know. So good. Anyway, well, yeah, clearly we are on the same page. So always a great way to start the discussion. But first of all, for the sake of consistency, do you prefer I call you Erin or Rachel?
For this one, I'll be Erin, since we're mostly talking about the Ex Hex.
Perfect.
I've joked before, Erin is actually my middle name. So if you say Rachel Erin, I'll just think my mom is mad at me. But I will happily accept either one. So yeah, we'll go with Erin for consistency for this one.
I love it. Yeah, exactly. I'm the same way. I'm Kelly Danielle Reynolds, and growing up, it was always Kelly Danielle. Like
Yeah.
anytime I got in trouble for anything. And so I've always thought about like if I ever did create like a pen name, maybe I would just be Kelly Danielle. And then I'd
Yeah,
be
there you
like,
go.
you influenced me, parents. Like I'm reclaiming this as a
Exactly.
positive thing. But only time will tell.
You shall see, yes.
Well, since we're on the subject of pen names, I am curious, just sort of like the process that is behind choosing a pen name. And obviously, you said Erin's your middle name, and so clearly there's a tie in there. But how and why was Erin Sterling born as opposed to publishing the Ex Hex under Rachel Hawkins?
Right. So it's kind of like just one of those weird things where it's like a business thing more than it was like
Sure.
actually like a creative thing. Because I had my adult debut under Rachel Hawkins, The Wife Upstairs had not come out yet. And so I think my publishers there, who like that book was already kind of in the process and they were doing some cool things for it. And I think they were a little bit like, okay, but you're ours first, okay? Like, which was fine. I enjoy a possessive publisher, to be honest. So they were,
Ooh.
they were like, yes, please fight over me, fight. But they were just really wanted to make sure that like the streams kind of stayed separate, as it were. And Avon, the publisher for the Ex Hex, was extremely cool with that. And so when we said like we would just prefer to do it under a pen name, just so that, especially because, like I said, I think if my adult debut had already come out or had a few books as an adult under the Rachel Hawkins name, I think it probably would have been okay to do the romance as Rachel Hawkins as well. But because like that hadn't really happened yet, it was like, let's make sure that these two things aren't tripping over each other as they're both coming out. So
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
And I've noticed a lot of authors will do it, especially if they're like diversifying what they're writing, because I know that before the Ex Hex, primarily you were writing YA and YA paranormal romance. And
right, exactly.
So I've seen this too. I know I've talked about this with Willow Winters and with Marie Lipscomb. They've done the same thing as kind of maybe the more erotic side they write under a different name, or the paranormal versus contemporary side they write under a different name.
It makes it easier for the readers too, who kind of can then know what they're getting into.
Yes.
Because like if you've read like my YA stuff is probably actually the closest to my romance stuff. But if you've read like The Wife Upstairs, that's a very different book than the Ex Hex. And so like you're not necessarily, I think, going to be like a fan of one and then also love the other. I mean, plenty of people have.
You might. I'm sure there are plenty of people that do.
Yeah, there are plenty of people who do. But at the same time, it's like it just makes sense to kind of like, if you're picking up now a Rachel Hawkins book, it's going to be this kind of like darkly comic gothic thrillers. And if you pick up an Erin Sterling book, you're going to get paranormal romantic comedy with a little added spice. Yeah, exactly. So
I am somebody who will enjoy that crossover immensely, because aside from romance, my go-to reads are mystery, thriller, crime. So it's the best of both worlds.
It is, and it's been so nice to write both. Like it's hard to do two very different books a year. And to promote two very different books a year to two very different audiences. There's definitely crossover, but it's still,
Right.
But at the same time, like I was like, what a great creative life I've sort of stumbled into now, where I get to have like the kissing books and the murder books.
Yes.
I enjoy reading both as well.
I do too. I might go out on a line and say, and I mean, come at me if you want, people listening, but I feel like people who read romance are maybe a little bit more inclined to also read a mystery by, especially if it's by an author that they're already familiar with, then maybe somebody who reads a mystery would be inclined to pick up a romance novel.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that that's true. In my experience as both, like a romance reader and just somebody that's kind of kept an eye on Romancelandia for years. I think that, romance readers are so voracious. And I definitely think, I mean, there's lots of people obviously who read all kinds of genres and stuff, but I definitely think like romance people are more open to like, and especially, if they know it's an author that they like, they'll give it a try, even if it's not a genre that they normally read. Yeah, because they're just super open to what they'll kind of get into.
Yeah, you and I were talking a little bit about cozy mysteries before we started recording, and I've found so many crossovers between the people who read romance and the people who read cozy mysteries.
Right. And a lot of those cozies have like kind of like romance subplot happening
Yeah.
throughout the books a lot of the time. So and there's a lot of writers who write both, under
Right.
different names. So,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it totally makes sense that there's like a connection there.
Now, starting with writing a little bit more on the YA side of things, did you always have plans to eventually cross over into writing adult, both romance or mystery, or was it, these particular stories that you've published like in the last year that called for more of an adult audience, and so that's sort of like why you decided to adapt them?
Yeah, it's interesting because like my YA career, I mean, it lasted for 10 years. And I say lasted like in past tense because I don't think I'll probably go back to writing YA because I really enjoyed it. But I kind of felt like I was kind of, after 10 years, I'm like, yeah, it's time for something new. But it was almost like an accident in a lot of ways. I had not been reading a huge amount of YA before I wrote my first book, Hex Hall. But that's just because there wasn't a huge amount of it out there. Like this was like, pre like Harry Potter, pre Twilight. We didn't have like a huge amount of choice. So like when I was a kid, I ran out of YA to read by the time I was like 13. If you were like a big reader, you'd kind of burned through all that there was. And so I'd moved on to romance when I was in like 7th or 8th grade and also horror. Like, I think there's like a like strong thing there of like kid readers where we're like, yes, romance novels and all that good stuff. And also Stephen King and Dean Koontz. And also like, then they also veer off into like the fantasy sci-fi with your like Mercedes Lackey and people like that. So I was reading adult fiction from the time I was a teenager. Then I started teaching high school when I was 24.
Oh.
And that was around like the like sort of mid 2000s. So like right after Twilight hit, basically. So I was kind of keeping up with like what was happening then in teen lit, which was something I had not paid any attention to up until that point, really. And was like, holy crap, like there's so much happening here and like so much good stuff. And so I was reading a lot of it to keep up with what I wanted to put in like my classroom library and stuff like that. And in reading it, I was suddenly like, oh, wait a minute. I want to try my hand at this. I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I'd never like, fits and starts. I'd start a book and stop a book and start a book and, and, but when I started reading YA, I was like, okay, I'm going to go into YA. So like I said, it was kind of like a weird circuitous route to becoming a YA author. And so this almost feels like what I'm doing now is more like where I expected to be if I thought about myself as a writer. When I was a kid, it would be writing adult. So yeah, it just basically about 2018 or so, I totally ran out of YA ideas, which like
fair enough.
Never. I know. I mean, I was just like, I'd written these 2 books that I really, really loved. I really wanted to write a 3rd one. Sales just didn't really justify it, which is how it goes sometimes. And so my editor was like, well, why don't you try like this kind of book? And I tried and she was like, eh. And I also kind of was like, eh. And luckily I only wrote like 10 pages of it. And then I tried another thing that I liked a little more, but she wasn't really into, that was in that kind of thriller, darkly funny space. And so it just felt like a good time. It's like, I'm a big believer in like, don't keep trying to like shove the square peg into the round hole.
Yeah.
Or, if the universe is closing doors to you, be like, this is happening for a reason. So just, stop banging on the door.
Yeah, I need to find another way out of the
yeah,
room.
Exactly. Go open a window or something because like this is not working. So yeah, so then it just made sort of sense to kind of turn to these more adult ideas.
Well, and honestly, I love what you said about like the square peg round hole because I feel like that is so true about, it's also true about reading. Like I say this to people all the time where I'm like, if you're reading a book, this is kind of like where we bring in the whole discussion about like DNFing a book is just like,
right.
If you're reading a book and it just feels like work, you're like forcing yourself to do it and it's just not clicking. It is okay to not finish reading it and
right.
maybe
and
even revisit it at like another time when you're in a different mood, a different headspace, like, or not.
Yeah. There are so many books that I like read like the first 10 pages of and was not feeling it, but just put it back on the shelf. And then like years later, sometimes we go back to it and like blew through it.
Right.
There are also books that like I read the first 10, 20 pages 3 times before I finally was like, you're never going to read this. So just go ahead and like donate it and be free.
And
like,
somebody else will read it
somebody
and
else
love
will
it.
find it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I
Life
think
is too short.
Exactly. I think you're right. The same rules apply to both like writing and reading in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. And I always think of like the Marie Kondo stuff, like does it spark
It
joy?
doesn't give you joy.
It doesn't spark joy. But one of the things that like she said that I loved when I first read the book that really like the thing that made it all click for me was that she was like, we have this like fear that like, you know, if you bought a book and then you didn't read it, that if you donated or whatever, it's wasted. Like you wasted that money or whatever. And she was like, no, because you learned you didn't really like that book or whatever. But like, think about it like that, as opposed to thinking about like, I've got to hold on to this thing that I don't even really like. Just be like, thank you for like the lesson that you taught me, and let it go. And that made it much easier to start like boxing up some books that like I was just never going to read.
Yes, because otherwise you become a hoarder, which, you know, like my parents, where every time I come home and help them clean out a closet, I'll find a picnic set that they were gifted like for their wedding 30 years ago and say, do we need to keep this? And
is this something that we need?
Well, but it's from this relative that's now passed. Okay, so but like they're not going to notice then if it's
if it's not here. It's fine. And again, like always think of it in that sense of like somebody else might really enjoy this. Like nobody's enjoying it sitting here in my closet or sitting on my shelf.
Thank you.
Like,
oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to bring you by next time I go to help clean out a closet.
I'll just cross the country and be like, hi.
Perfect.
I'm here to teach you some things.
We're here. Let's have a talk. Well, so writers, obviously, since we're talking about reading, writers are usually also voracious readers. So I'm curious, what are some of your favorite tropes and or some of your favorite authors to read?
I love a trope. I really do. I love so many good tropes. This book, the Ex Hex, really is like one of my absolute favorites, which is the second chance romance, the exes reunited, which I think I only love because I myself do not really have any exes. Like I got married quite young. So like I have no strong feelings for the guy I went to like my senior prom with. You know what I mean? Like I met my husband.
Safe choice.
Yeah. I met my husband when I was like 20. So like there had just been like a couple of dudes before him and they're nice guys, you know. So that I was never very serious about. So yeah, I think that's why I like it so much. I also love a good road romance. I love like we must go from point A to point B together. And,
yes.
You know, I love sort of like forced proximity, like we're trapped somewhere together. When I was a kid, like deserted island type Blue Lagoon-y situations were very appealing to me. I love a good enemies to lovers, but like that one is one where I'm really like sometimes when you read them, you're like, oh, you guys are just being dicks to each other. Like there's no kind
there's
of, you
different
know,
levels like of enemies to lovers.
So I either need you to like literally be trying to kill each other for the English throne or something, or like you're just kind of snarky work rivals.
That's
like,
exactly how I feel about it.
Either end of the spectrum, but like that middle thing where you guys are like being like a little hostile, like that's too much for me. So,
I completely agree. I'm like, I can take mortal enemies, rival, mafia, like totally fine. And then I can also take like, oh, we just like share cubicles and like he chews too loudly. Like that's
exactly.
That's fine with me too.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because all of your tropes that you mentioned like go really well together too. Like enemies to lovers, road trip, forced proximity.
Forced proximity, they're in a car. Yeah, exactly. And exes to lovers or exes to reuniting or whatever can a lot of times be enemies to lovers, depending on what the breakup was like.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love all those kind of things. For authors that I love, I always, I love Serena Bowen. I just think Serena Bowen is so like consistently great. I love Christina Lauren, but I also like love them as friends. So that's kind of almost not fair.
Yeah, I have like a crush on them, like as humans.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, and they're literally like, we've like vacationed together and gone to concerts and stuff, and they're like as nice and fun as they seem online. Aww. Like they are 10 times more in real life. Like they're just the loveliest humans. So I love them. And who else do I love? Sarah McLean is always like, nobody's doing it in historical romance like Sarah Mac.
Mm-hmm.
Love her. I love Rebecca Weatherspoon, who's now doing like these very cool like
Oh,
westerns based on fairy tales. Oh, they're so good.
I love Rebecca. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, all of the authors you've mentioned, I've read multiple books by each of them, but
Yeah.
we did Rebecca Weatherspoon's Zenny for the
Yeah.
podcast, and oh God, that just blew me away.
There's nothing she can't do is the thing. Like she can do it all. Like I've read like she had like lesbian vampire books and those were
Great.
amazing.
Yep.
And like her like Black Cowboys are amazing
So
and
good.
you know, Zenny is amazing. So yeah, she's fabulous. So yeah, those are some of my like go-to.
Those are hard hitters.
I like too many.
Some great recommendations.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Serena Bowen, at the time that we're recording this, I'm getting ready to pack my bags and head to Indies Invade Philly in Philadelphia
Right.
this weekend, and Serena is going to be there.
Yes, she is the coolest. I don't know her personally, except like how we talk on Twitter, but I really like her a lot. So I was like one of those things where you're like, "That's my friend," and you're like, "Well, is she?" I don't know, but I'm
That's
calling
like
her my friend.
that's like 90% of the friendships I have these days are
I say all the time, like my friend, and it's like literally somebody I've talked to like 3 times on Twitter.
you know what? That counts.
It's valid.
In 2021,
Exactly.
that absolutely counts.
Yeah.
Well, as we've mentioned, you have your new adult romance out, The Ex Hex, published under the name Erin Sterling, and it is a wonderful mishmash, or should I say, witch's brew, full
Nice.
of second chance romance, magical shenanigans, small town cuteness, which if you want to hear Erin and I talk a little bit more about small town realness, you can absolutely check it out in our bonus clip on Patreon. But I think that this is a book that a lot of people will fall in love with. And before I go any further, would you mind just sort of giving a brief synopsis for our listeners of the Ex Hex?
Yes. So the Ex Hex is the story of Vivi Jones, who is a young witch. When she's 19, she has a very brief but very intense summer fling with a Welsh witch named Rhys Penhallow. It ends badly, and when it does, she and her cousin drunkenly and jokingly curse him, not thinking the curse is real because they're being silly. But when he has to come back into town almost 10 years later, it's clear that the curse is very real and that it has further reaching consequences than they had foreseen. So Rhys and Vivi must work together to remove the curse and save the town, all while trying not to fall back in love with each other.
That was very succinct. Excellent.
Thank
I'm
you.
sure you've given this synopsis like 50 times at least. So it seems like you've honed it into like
Thank
a
you.
very
Yeah,
succinct.
I've really been working on it because I was like, it's got so many little points. You want to be sure that like you're
You
hitting
nailed
them all.
it. No,
Thank
you got it
Thank you very
for
much.
sure. So I guess my first thought is that one of the things I really love about this witchy romance in particular is the fact that it very much takes place in a contemporary, realistic setting where people just happen to have, powers and practice witchcraft. But it's not a fantastical, like mystical world. Like we are very much living in America or Wales. Today.
But they all have iPhones. They drive cars, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They just also brew things. But what attracted you to writing about the world of witchcraft in general, and then just more specifically about witchcraft and setting it in a contemporary, realistic environment?
Yeah, I had done some of it with my YA stuff before. So, like, my first series, Hex Hall. So it's very funny to have like 2 Hex books. Like, it just came full circle 11 years later. But those kind of books had dealt with that. I had written like several YAs that had like a paranormal element, but they were set in our time and all that. I was born in 1979, but I'm a kid of the 90s in a lot of ways. So I grew up with like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and stuff like that. And so I always loved that, or Charmed, those kind of those shows
best.
that like mixed the paranormal with the contemporary. I always thought there are so many interesting stories to tell when you like smush those things together. So that was part of it. I love to read like traditional fantasy, you know, like where they're like in castles and what have you, and there's dragons and all that. But I think there's something really fun about sort of an urban fantasy or contemporary paranormal vibe.
I agree. It makes it, I think, a little bit more digestible for at least a reader like myself, where I've talked about this on the podcast before. As much as I love the world of fantasy, I am also what you would call a lazy reader. And I have a really hard time investing myself, my time, my brain power into kind of diving into a series where they're creating so much world building that it takes me a while to like get into it. And so I think kind of by setting it in a contemporary, you know, more urban, realistic location, it kind of helps me along by knowing that, well, they do have phones, they do have cars, they do go to universities. Like this is very much my world with this added paranormal element.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a lot more accessible. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I think that with fantasy as well, as somebody that enjoys them, they really can be where you're like, how much am I going to have to invest in like understanding? Because that's actually my thing, is that I think like a good fantasy writer, like, I was a huge fan, still am a huge fan of like the Game of Thrones books, the Song of Ice and Fire, which they're complicated for sure.
Yep.
That world is very complicated, but he does such a good job of like that first book. You don't quite get all the like undercurrents and who's who or whatever, but I think by such little things as like using regular names, you know, people are like John, Ned, Rob, like, so you don't have like anything. And eventually it just starts to make sense to you as you go through, which is what I always used to tell friends who were going to read them, that I was like, don't try to overthink it. There will come a point like halfway through the book where suddenly you just understand who everybody is and how everybody's connected to each other and what happened 20 years ago that, you know, but I those were the exception for me, because like so much of fantasy sometimes can get a little like, to me, like bogged down in the world building.
Yeah.
Right. Like, whereas I'm like, just give me the story and I'll put the pieces together in the background, you know, but I want the story. And sometimes I think, you know, with fantasy, it gets a little hung up on the like.
I think that's where I'm at too, is that I have to find either a story or a character or set of characters to cling to in order to be able to like make that full dive into the book or what is usually a series. And if it focuses a little too heavily on the world itself in the beginning, that's not as much of a draw to me as it is to following like a specific character's journey.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, and I do think that's part of the reason why things like contemporary fantasy and paranormal fantasy and things like that are so popular, because people they love the magic and all that. But they don't always want like Hogarth the Bard in the background or whatever. And like, that's fair, you know?
Oh, please let there be a Hogarth.
Good old Hogarth the Bard.
I can just picture him. He's like a burly man. He's got a beard that's like maybe a little too long. Hasn't shaved in a while. I like me some Hogarth.
Hogarth. He's probably got an apostrophe in his name for no apparent reason.
Yeah, between the O and the G.
Right.
You know, just cause. But well, and so, you know, since you're a fan of like fantasy and paranormal yourself, I'm curious, like, what amounts of the Ex Hex did you draw from like lore fantasy elements that we traditionally associate with witches and just the world of witchcraft? And are there any more fantastical elements that you added yourself? Like, did you add to the lore or create any things that maybe we don't necessarily usually think of when we think of witches?
Yeah. So one of the great things about using witches is that they're so popular in pop culture, and we've got such a long history of them in pop culture that you don't have to give your readers too much, because your readers are coming in with preconceived notions, and they'll slot right into them. You know what I mean? They'll come to the book and be like, yeah, I get what you're doing. And so that was really helpful. There are definitely things though that I just sort of made up because they sounded cool. So there's a whole part in the book about a Eurydice candle, which is a candle that can trap a spirit. That I made that up. And just because I thought it sounded cool. Like I
I
wanted
liked
some
it.
sort of candle magic, and
Yeah.
the Eurydice. I'm a nerd for Greek mythology stuff, so it seemed to make sense if you're trying to bring someone spirit back, that you might call it that. So yeah, so stuff like that I made up. A lot of the like kind of ritual stuff. Again, though,
Mhm.
people come in and they're like, if you're like they're standing there and they're saying words and they've got their hands out to their side or whatever, you see that. You know what that
Witch.
looks like. Yeah, exactly.
She's a witch.
You've seen Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and you've seen Buffy, and you've seen Charmed, and you've seen all those things. You've seen Practical Magic,
Yep.
and so you're willing to come along with me on it.
I did like the Eurydice candle, and I will say I am a sucker for like anything witchy. Like I've definitely gone through that phase of like buying tarot cards and having
Yeah.
crystals and everything, which I think is definitely on the rise again.
Oh,
And
big time, big
I
time.
love that you actually mentioned that in the book. Like anybody can be a witch these days, and they sell all these things for people to buy
Yep.
so that they too can be a witch, which is perfectly fine by me. But the Eurydice candle, when I was envisioning it, I kept thinking, I'm like, you know what this is? This is the witchy version of capturing a ghost from Ghostbusters.
Right,
Like it's just
exactly.
instead of like a big old like thing on your back and a
Fancy
tubey,
contraption. Yeah,
yeah,
nobody wants
it's
that.
a candle,
Like,
which is like
yeah.
so much more beautiful and romantic than Ghostbusters, obviously.
Right. But yeah, the purpose is basically the same. Yeah.
I like this version better.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
The other thing, and I know we brought this up during our book club discussion, was the fact that the gender neutral usage of the term witches, which you apply to both male and female characters who are witches in the book. And that was something that surprised me. But then finding out that your background is in studying like gender studies, I was
Right.
like, well, that makes perfect sense. But I love that you made that choice.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think we're all sort of like learning and trying to do better and be better and listening to people.
Sure.
And I was thinking like, I can't even remember now, like where I saw it from. But just about the way, like there are certain times when like you just don't need to use gendered language. And I thought that I was like, in Hex Hall, which I wrote in 2010, like it's witches and warlocks,
Mm-hmm.
it's witches for girls and warlocks for boys. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Like that's just kind of limiting, and like let's open it up some. Like I said, it's definitely a thing I think I could do better about, and I'm still trying to kind of like change some of my like super gendered language. I think especially when we're talking about romance, it can be. I'm
Mm-hmm.
still bad about like. I try not to say like hero and heroine too much because I'm like, oh right, that's like super binary, and like you can just say love
Right.
interest or main character or whatever. So similar with like witches, I was just like let's reflect a little bit more of like some changes that have been happening in the last few years, just in how we think about how we use words. And so yeah, it was it seemed like a very easy thing to do too. To be like
Well, and it's a great step to take. It's a great example of like something that you can apply specifically to the books that you're writing. Like it's a great
right,
way to kind of recognize like, well, what exactly can I do to, reflect the changes that we're seeing in the world and the way that people are talking now? How can I put that into my books? Because I feel like in the last couple of years, we see so many readers and bloggers and podcasters like trying to hold authors and publishers more accountable for some of the
right,
things they say in their books, for some of the ways they portray certain characters in their books, or the lack of representation in their
yeah,
books. And this is a great way to just show that it's a small step, but it is a step. I mean,
right,
it's
and
you
it's just
recognizing it and putting it into practice.
right. It's just trying to be a little bit more aware that, like, because,
Yeah.
like, again, as like a cis person, like that would never occur to me that, like, oh, having it be super binary could feel like slightly alienating
Yeah.
to non-binary readers or just readers who are more
Mhm.
aware of that kind of thing. So I was like, oh, right, like, why would I do that when like there's like a less harmful way to do something? Let me try to go like the do less harm way then for sure.
Yeah. I think a lot of people will really appreciate it. Like, I mean, maybe it seems like a small step for you, but I do think that there's a lot of people who will really appreciate that choice,
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
myself included.
Yeah.
It's something that I still work on because I know that I have a bad habit of saying hero and heroine, although I do try to specify, like, specifically in a, male-female romance or a heterosexual romance, whatever it
Right.
might
Yeah.
be, like
Yeah.
just to put it into context. But the way I think about it now too is like when I do give like a book recommendation, I try to say like in the major notes, like, here are the two main characters. It's an MF romance or it's an
Right.
FF romance. Just because if we have to specify in reviews or acknowledgments that it's a queer-based love story, then you might as well also have to share the fact that it's a love story between two people of the opposite gender as
Yeah.
well. Like, just
Absolutely.
normalize
Absolutely.
it for everybody.
Right. I'm really, obviously we all have like ways to go, but it has been really heartening. I
Right.
think that like romance is really trying is the
I
thing.
do
And
too.
that's, and to do better on those kind of things. And to just, like I said, the more open it can be, the better, the less harm it does, the better. So yeah.
Much like any genre, I think romance goes through lots of phases, and
Mhm.
along with fairy tale retellings and a surprise dose of monster erotica.
The monster books are like really taking
Wow.
off
Yeah.
lately.
I think 2021 also saw the rise of witches in romance.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm wondering, where do you think that's coming from?
Yeah, it's the coolest thing to me, like to see like how many witch romances came out like within like six
Yeah.
weeks of each other. And sometimes I think people think people get like competitive or they get weird or they're like, well, I wrote a witch book, but why are all these witch? And I'm always like, no, that's like the worst way to think about it, because it's like there's this cartoon that I saw on Tumblr that I love where it's like a person like eating a cake and like a writer being like, oh, I have a cake too, and that they've already got a cake, and it's like, but what the reader thinks, and they've got like forks in both cakes and they're like, yes, more cake,
give me more cakes,
give me more cake. And I'm like, that's the thing. I was like, it's that thing of like a rising tide lifts all boats. And I'm like, if somebody loved your witch book, they are going to be like, where are the other witch books? Like, nobody's like, I've had enough of this now. I enjoyed this one book, so it's over for me. That's like not how it works.
No, that's exactly how I think about it. And I love the cake analogy. I've never been able to find the perfect way to explain this, and now I have. So thank you.
I'm
and
so
thank
sorry
you, Tumblr.
I'm sorry the listeners won't see me like actually like miming out like the two forks and the cakes and they're shoveling the cake in, more cake. But you can imagine it. You can imagine it.
I'll try, you know what? I'll try to recreate some sort of graphic, and maybe it'll just be me eating multiple cakes. I don't know.
I need to find the original cartoon though, because I was like, that's it. That's what more people need to think about. But publishing can make people insane, and then they just think like, no, it's mine, my little, But luckily, everybody who had a witch book come out this year was like amazing and totally understood that like we were all making cake and everybody was going to be excited. I think like it's just one of those weird things that happen. Like I'm a big believer in like the noosphere, like sometimes ideas just take hold in like sort of general consciousness, and everybody's like tuning into that wavelength or whatever. So I think that's part of it. I think a lot of it too is romances, and especially these kind of contemporary rom-coms we've been seeing for the past few years. They've done so well, and there have been a ton of them, and they've done gangbusters. And I think whenever you have something that's been successful, people kind of start looking for like I want to do that, but with a twist, and I think like we saw it like, if you look at like, because I came out of YA, like YA trends were very much like that. So you had like a string of like dark paranormals for a while, like Twilight and Shiver and Wicked Lovely and stuff like that. And then about a couple of years after those, you have like a string of like my book and Kirsten White's Paranormalcy and like lighter, funnier paranormals that weren't quite so angsty. And so I think that is part of it. When something is doing well, people want more of that, but slightly different. So I think that's part of it. And witches, I think, makes sense, like to add on to a sort of romantic comedy background. And I also think, like you said, like there was just a huge rise in the interest in that kind of thing. Like I even saw like in my little stores, like little local Alabama bookstores, suddenly there were, 12, 15 sets of tarot cards you could buy, whereas there used to be 3. Crystals were everywhere. There were suddenly like subscription boxes and stuff like that.
I don't know like where it came from, because I know growing up, my vision of witches were a lot more of the witches who use who like shoot magic out of their fingertips and
Right.
who brew potions and have magic wands. And somewhere along the way, and I can't think of what it is that really shifted it, there became this different version of like the modern witch and how she is more about intentions as opposed to physical magic. And she uses stuff from the earth and tarot cards and crystals. And it became so much more natural and also like attainable for like the everyday person that
Right.
I think this message came across that like anybody can be a witch if they want
Right.
to be a witch. And I love it. I mean, I'm currently doing a Dungeons and Dragons campaign where we were all witches. I mean, I am so here for it. And I wish I knew like where that shift started. And part of me wants to say it is somewhat like politically driven.
No, I was like, I don't want to get political on the podcast. However,
I mean,
will.
This is people who listen
I
to
will
this
say-
podcast know I will.
Yeah, I figured. I was like, I feel like there's something that happened around 2016 that made women lose their minds and suddenly want like some kind of power or some sort of just something that felt like we were in control of something a little bit, you know? So I think that is a huge part of like why it exploded. And I think it sort of has slid into this almost like the sort of witchy stuff like coincides to me. I think there's like some interesting connections to be made with like the wellness thing. Like obviously people who are into the witchy stuff aren't necessarily into like Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop and all that. But I think there's some overlap in some of it. Not for me personally, but I think there's some overlap there. And
like
I also think
idea, I totally like the grand idea.
I think you also saw like around the same time as like witchcraft really started taking off. Suddenly everybody had like super complicated skincare routines. It was like, here's my 10-step, which I mean, I got into it too, but like, which almost feels like a ritual, right? It's like my potions that I do, and I have 10 of them. And I will say for the like 2 months that I did that, my skin has never looked so good in my entire life. It was just a lot to keep up with.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's all, like I said, it's connected. It's political. It is too about like self-care as we sort of as that became a catchphrase. I think now we've got this like rise of like the cottagecore aesthetic.
Yes,
where
we do.
Everybody wants to be like a forest witch and they want to like sew sweaters and make fancy teas and all that. And it's
over the fire, the natural fire.
Right. And I think that there's, like I said, I think a lot of it is just the past few years being very bizarre and hard. And I totally understand that there's this desire almost to like pull back from everything and also be like self-sustaining in every possible way. And so, yeah, I think it all is tied up in an interesting ball there of a bunch of different things.
I agree. And I didn't even really think about it, but just, I mean, thinking about the different stages of the pandemic we've had and like remembering that period of time where everybody was baking and remembering that period of time where everybody was discussing, well, since I can't go out and do things, this is going to be me becoming the healthiest version of myself inside out. Like there were so many different stages that I think all kind of tied in to like this modern idea of what it means to be a witch. And it makes perfect sense then that that's been amplified. And I mean, not just in our reality, but also in the Ex Hex, because we have a family who sells these witchy goods to people, some of them are have magic like attached to them. I did like that distinction of like some of these items have magic and then others are just tarot cards for the everyday person to pick up.
Yeah, just they're a cool
souvenir.
journal or something. Yeah, exactly.
But it was nice to see that reflected in the book as well. Like we're very conscious of the fact that this is what it has become in our reality, that this is also in the book as well, and it's their reality.
That's exactly. That's the world we're all living in.
And I like that in my books. I like to see things that are part of my life and then also see things where I'm like, ooh, that's something that should be a part of our lives. Like, because I think that's how we draw from the experiences that we read and see and we emulate them. And then vice versa, we put them back into the work that we're creating. So at least we should be.
Yeah, we should be. Yeah.
Well, we are gearing up for the holiday season.
Yes.
And of course, I'm inhaling small town romance after small town romance, festival after festival. But
yes.
I feel like thinking about it, especially as I'm, planning this epic holiday special, I feel like we don't get to see enough books and movies repping small town festivals before and after the Christmas season. So that was one thing I loved about the Ex Hex is the fact that Graves Glen is all about the spookier side of, fall. And I wonder why we don't have as many books and movies and TV shows focusing on that than just Christmas.
I don't know, man. Christmas has got a chokehold on it. And I enjoy a Christmas romance too. Don't get me wrong.
Same.
But I think though, I'm hoping that this year, because so many witch romances just did really well. And I think showed that there's a real hunger for this kind of romance as well. So I'm really hoping that in the future, we're going to start seeing more come on, Netflix, start making Halloween romance movies. I really think that people are in the mood for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I feel like Hallmark has capitalized on the Christmas love stories. And I do say Christmas because that's the holiday they're focusing on, not
right. Every once in a while
Hanukkah.
They try to pretend it's something else. They're here's our one Hanukkah movie.
Our
everyone.
Holiday season. No, you have one Hanukkah movie. That does not make this.
And it's usually the person celebrating Hanukkah and also someone celebrating Christmas within the same movie.
We have to coexist together. Oh my gosh. No, it is very much about Christmas. But if there is, whether it's Netflix, Lifetime, whoever, if there is one network that is willing to take the same commitment towards fall, Halloween, spooky romance stories that Hallmark takes for Christmas, oh my gosh, I will give you all my money.
All my money for the Pumpkin Spice Channel. Come on.
Exactly. That's what it should be. It should be something where when you break it down to the initials, it comes down to PSL as the network.
Exactly. That's what it needs to be. So look at us. We're manifesting.
Here we are.
Here we speak.
Hire us. We've got the ideas.
It's all we need. All we need.
Well, speaking of this small town specifically, Graves Glen, let's talk about what is still to come, because I know from our discussion before that you have some ideas for future stories in this world.
Yes. So I definitely have a second book coming out if I can ever finish writing it. So I'm still writing it, but my publisher's probably yes, we're very aware of that. So yes, there's definitely a second book coming out. It's Gwen's book, who's the cousin in the Ex Hex, and she is a handful. And she's been a handful to write, but hey, we're getting there. So I've got that one tentatively called The Kiss Curse. Then I'm hoping to do some more. I definitely, Reese in the Ex Hex has two brothers.
Yes, he does.
And so I'd like to there's one getting left out. So I'd like to give him his time to shine, hopefully. And then I would love to do, as I believe we talked about in book club, I would love to do, a Yule set Ex Hex world, so that it's Christmassy, but it's not Christmas, and so that's what I'm hoping. And then I have a couple of more ideas for sort of more paranormal rom-coms, but not necessarily witches, not necessarily Graves Glen, but the same kind of vibe.
I will read it all, starting with Gwen, because I am a Gwen. I feel like if you read the Ex Hex, you're either going to be I'm the Vivi or I'm the Gwen, and I'm much closer to the Gwen
as well. Yeah. If people have asked me about Vivi, and I'm Vivi is actually one of the hardest characters I've ever written because she's so different from me. So I was but Gwen is much more my speed. Yeah. So.
Yes. Yeah. See, there's a reason we get along so well. And
absolutely.
I think a lot of the same things. We're both Gwens.
Exactly.
No, I look forward to that, and I would love to see books for Reese's brothers, whether or not they take place in Graves Glen or even in Wales.
Yeah, exactly. Because Wales is a really fun place to sort of explore some. So yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
That'll
Gotta
be
get through Gwen
exciting.
first.
Gotta get through Gwen. I know.
Gotta get through Gwen.
She's a tough cookie to crack.
She is. She really is.
Well, is there anything else you're currently working on, or is our focus on Gwen specifically for the time being?
So yeah, that's the one I'm like actively writing. But I
Okay.
also have a new thriller coming out under Rachel Hawkins in January called Reckless Girls.
Ooh.
That is, it's set on a deserted island in the South Pacific. It's got yachts, it's got secrets, it's got all kinds of fun stuff. So it's a crazy book, and I can't wait for people to read it.
Yachts and secrets, two of my favorite things.
I'm hoping that like in January, people will really want to like read a book that's like everybody's hot and sitting like both metaphorically and literally, and sitting on a beach. You know, hopefully like that will feel good post Christmas. I think so.
I agree, especially when like the super cold months set in, depending on where you live. Like there is nothing like reading a tropical, you know, set romance mystery, whatever it is, like during those months. Like those, I'm more inclined to read those during winter months than I am in summer months.
Yeah, same. I love those kind of books. So yeah, I've always wanted to write this type of book. I've always wanted to do like a beach thriller, basically. So that is coming out in January. And then I just finished working on my thriller for 2023, which is also, that one's still so in early stages, but it's set in Italy, which has been really fun to write about. So, and sort of features two best friends going on like a writer's retreat in a house where a famous murder happened back in the 70s. And they are connecting the dots between what happened 40 years ago and what's happening now. So yeah, it's
I
fun.
love that because, I mean, give me a true crime documentary like any day. Like I am all about those cold cases. Love it.
Yeah. So it's been a lot of fun to work on. So yeah, so it's you know, like I said, my dance card stays full, which is a nice thing.
Way to bring it back to the dance card.
Exactly.
No, that's great. Well, yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to look forward to. And obviously somewhere along the way, we will hopefully find a place for Gwen to fit in because I need her story.
It should be out next year. Like I've just got to like buckle down and finish. So
buckle down. Come on, Gwen. Work with me. But no, and if people haven't read the Ex Hex yet, please go do yourselves a favor and pick up a copy. It is also a super quick read. Like I think I breezed through it in 1 or 2 sittings. In fact, I think I read most of it in the bathtub, which is
where I love for people to read. It's where I love to read.
It's where I do my best reading is in the tub. So don't let the fact that we're, you know, on to like holiday reading put you off from reading about these wonderful world of witches.
Yeah, it's still very cozy. It'll carry you through the Christmas season, I promise.
Very cozy. Very cozy. And you will have dreams and fantasize about moving to this small town until you listen to our Patreon discussion about small towns. So that being said, where can the wonderful people find and follow you and all of your writing journeys?
Yes, so I am on Twitter at Lady Hawkins, all together like that, Lady Hawkins. And then I am also on Instagram as Lady Hawkins. My website is forever My Great White Whale. It is a work in progress. It has been for like a year now, but and then hopefully that will be up soonish. But yeah, so I just keep everything under sort of the Lady Hawkins handle, and that's where you can find me.
Perfect. And then final question for you before I let you go, and that is there a dream project or story that you are dying to tell?
I would love to do like a real like old-fashioned Victoria Holt style Gothic novel.
Ooh.
Like the full kind of Rebecca experience or whatever. Like set in the past too. I've done kind of these modern Gothics. So yeah, that's my dream is to write an old school Gothic like that with a twist, because you can't write like innocent virgins and like scary men that they marry and like just go with that anymore.
That's all been done.
Yeah, that's been done. So it would need a little updating, but yes, I wanted to one day do a big splashy Gothic. That's my dream.
But Gwen comes first.
Gwen comes first. Absolutely.
Well, I look forward to reading Gwen. I look forward to checking out some of your, more mystery thriller books. And eventually, I'd love to read this Gothic novel of yours. So I'm going to hold you to that.
Cross fingers. Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening. Boobies and Newbies is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts. You can follow Boobies and Newbies on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Boobies Podcast.